Welcome to another Infographic Instant with your host, Brian Michael. In this episode, we're going to be asking the question, which shadow bank markets have likely been the most profitable over time, over the last decade, over the time period that we talk about in the paper. In the paper from which this infographic comes, we provide tips and clues for aspiring shadow bankers about where they can most expand their business in order to maximize their shadow banking profits. Now, in order to guess which markets will see the biggest growth of shadow banking in the future, we have to look at the profit motive. Behind all capitalist expansion lies the profit motive. In previous infographics, we showed that, for example, in Russia, we have not seen a very vigorous expansion of shadow banking. And when we ask why, we have to look, of course, at the main driver, which are profits to shadow bankers. Now, let's turn our attention to this infographic in order to understand the profit motive behind engaging in shadow banking recently. This infographic is not the easiest to read out of the series, and therefore it requires a bit of interpretation. On the y-axis, we show the inflation-adjusted one-year return on $100. So this is a proxy for the returns to shadow banking of lending money out basically at a risk premium slightly higher than that local country's prime rate. So this is a proxy for returns to shadow banking in each of these economies. Above the bar charts, we show the average inflation-adjusted return on the country index, equity index for that country. So as we know, investors, they have both substitutability and complementarity options in terms of putting their money either in stocks or in debt. Should shadow bankers lend out to companies? Should they put it in the local stock market? Or what is most likely, should they engage in a combination of the two? And we see from these data that we can divide countries into basically 5 different categories. Those countries that have relatively high shadow banking returns in very vigorous equity markets, those that have high shadow banking returns during a period when equity prices weren't doing very well, those countries that have seen booming stock markets but not very booming lending markets, and of course those countries that haven't done well altogether in various types of securities, both equities and lending. And of course there's those countries that have just kind of plodded along, showing neither high nor low returns in any particular field. Now, looking at this almost 2-by-2 classification, if you will, we see that Indonesia and Chile have been some of the most promising countries in terms of shadow banking, but also in terms of putting your money in the local stock market. Those two countries were the countries that you really wanted your money to be in. For Brazil and Argentina, they had lots of shadow banking profit opportunities, but the local stock market didn't do very well. So we could see why shadow banking would be very attractive to these countries. And indeed, in previous infographics, we've shown that we saw very rapid expansion of shadow banking in these countries. Turkey has seen relatively low profitability in lending and shadow banking during a period of a booming stock market. And countries such as Russia, Singapore, and India have seen low returns overall. In a previous infographic, we showed that shadow banking activity in Russia, Singapore, certainly in those two countries, has been moribund lately. And we can see from the profit results you see in front of you why shadow banking in those economies has not picked up in any significant way. Finally, in some countries such as Mexico and China, we see neither high nor low shadow banking returns. In all likelihood, it's not the profit motive which has been driving expanding shadow banking, but other factors such as such a booming economy that local households and businesses really needed to get access to credit by any means available. Therefore, it's this 2x2 dichotomy of shadow banking / lending and putting money in the stock market, which really helps us to understand the expansion of shadow banking. And for those aspiring shadow bankers in the audience, the only question that we have to ask ourselves is what we think interest rates in these countries will do and what we think local equity prices in these countries will do. Indonesia and Chile still certainly seem like pretty good bets. Question marks hang over Mexico and China as usual, whereas we will most likely see continued sluggish performance in Russia, Singapore, and India. This has been another Infographic Instant with Brian Michael.